And welcome back to Capitol Tonight. A report out today by the New York Civil Liberties Union found that police departments across the state are increasingly relying on tasers. Those are those electric shock weapons that employ currents to disrupt voluntary control of muscles. NYCLU's analysis of data from 8 upstate law enforcement agencies revealed that most officers are not actually properly trained on how to use these potentially deadly devices, putting lives unnecessarily at risk. Joining me now is the co-author of this report, New York NYCLU's Senior Staff Attorney Corey Stoughton. Corey, thank you very much for being with us. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So this is actually pretty disturbing, and thankfully I've never been tased, but it sounds like it is very painful. Nearly 60% of all incidents did not meet expert recommended usage of this device. What does that mean specifically?
Well, what that means is that over the last 10 years, as the use of tasers has grown so quickly, law enforcement experts and the United States Department of Justice, along with a law enforcement expert agency called the Police Executive Research Forum, have come up with guidelines that represent best practices for law enforcement agencies to guide their officers in the use of tasers.
Right.
And what those recommendations say is that tasers should only be used when there is a demonstrable risk of physical injury to someone, whether it's the officer or the person who's being tased or a third party. And what we found in looking at more than 850 individual incident reports from a range of police departments was that in some 60% of those incident reports, officers had not documented that necessary risk of physical injury to somebody before they used a taser.
So these can be deadly. The use of these things can be deadly. Obviously, police are empowered to use deadly force, so in very specific situations. What you guys are trying to highlight here is not tasers, get rid of them. It's tasers, let's train people to use them better.
That's exactly right. And if there's one takeaway from this report that someone were to focus on, I think it's busting the myth that tasers are only used or predominantly used as a substitute for more lethal force, like guns. If that were the case, then I think that people would be hard-pressed to argue that tasers are doing more good than harm. But in fact, if you look at what's happening with tasers in New York on the ground, the vast majority of uses of tasers are not anywhere near in situations where use of a lethal force would be acceptable. Instead, what you're seeing are incidents where officers are using tasers merely as a way to enforce compliance with a police order. So you have someone who's, for example, verbally resistant, saying, no, I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to move over there, I'm not going to get down from that step, or whatever it is that the officer has ordered. And as a default mechanism, officers are too quickly resorting to using tasers to enforce compliance when other less dangerous methods were probably available.
So, but are you saying, when we talk about the lack of training, it seems to me that all too often departments, according to your report, are relying only on this kind of instructional video that comes from the manufacturer and not creating their own department standards that would comply with those accepted use practices that you talked about just as we started this interview. Instead, they're just saying, okay, here's a video, go for it.
That's exactly right, and that's a major problem. And it's not just the New York Civil Liberties Union saying that it's a major problem. Again, if you go to law enforcement experts, national law enforcement experts, and look at the recommendations that they've put in place to ensure that tasers are used safely and that they live up to their promise of making departments and the people that they serve more safe, you'll see that every one of those experts cautions against relying only on the training materials created by the manufacturer of these weapons and urges departments to develop training materials that integrate tasers into that department's use of force spectrum so that officers are making smart decisions about when to deploy tasers and in what appropriate situations. Yeah, and we were really disturbed to find that so many departments weren't doing that.
Well, the only one that actually has independent training outside of what the manufacturer provides is Rochester. Is that correct?
That's right. The only one of the departments whose training policies we looked at. That's not to say there are no other departments in New York who are doing that. There probably are. I hope that there are. But given the sample that we looked at, the rate at which departments seem to be defaulting to just those training materials is pretty troubling.
We should also just inform viewers that this report does not include New York City, which would have probably had a whole different set of data because of how many people there are, how large the police force, how many incidents there are, et cetera. And why did you choose? Is that why you chose not to include New York City?
That's exactly right. Although in the report we do talk about New York City's, the NYPD's taser use of force policy. And actually, if you look at it, it's one of the few policies that reflects intelligent, reflective thinking and study of the expert proposals. And in many ways, the NYPD's policy is a good model that we think other departments that have not yet gotten around to catching up to those expert standards should take a look at, because it covers many of the deficiencies that we saw in other departments' policies. For example, not having clear guidance that the use of tasers should only happen when there's this risk of physical injury, ensuring that you're not tasering particularly vulnerable populations like the elderly or juveniles or pregnant women or people experiencing severe intoxication, and a range of other guidelines that these expert proposals suggest.
You are hoping that the Department of Justice, the state, the DOJ, right, the Department of Criminal Justice,
That's right,
would make this kind of training mandatory. Is there legislation at this point that's being drafted that would accomplish that?
No, we're not aware of any legislation that would accomplish that. One mechanism that it would be relatively easy for the state to get involved in encouraging better training and better use of force policies is by promulgating model training and use of force policies and using the agencies that already exist in the Division of Criminal Justice Services to encourage local law enforcement agencies to review their policies and their training and look at the expert guidelines and try to bring those two things closer together.
Yeah, well, do you think that one thing, and this might be a little out of left field, that might be helpful is that if the training also mandated that police officers experienced being tased? Because I would imagine that if you knew exactly what it felt like, much like what pepper spray feels like or what it might feel like to be in hand-to-hand combat, that you might be a little bit more judicious about the employment of that particular weapon?
It's an interesting idea. One thing that several departments across the country have experimented with that idea, and what's interesting and troubling about that is that many of them have almost immediately or very quickly abandoned that policy because of the incredible number of workman's comp claims that result from the instances in which officers get tasered. I mean, tasers, there's a popular image out there that tasers are not a big deal. Whether you're a fan of Veronica Mars like I am and she had a taser, or you've seen Mall Cop or any of these movies or TV shows where people get tased, and it perpetuates this idea that actually it's not that big of a deal. In fact, tasers deliver 50,000 volts of energy up to that and can cause really serious injuries. And the danger in departments who have adopted this policy of tasing their own officers is that some of those officers have been injured, and that creates workman comp costs to those departments, and they've abandoned that policy, which is really telling about how dangerous tasers really are.
Well, if that is indeed the case, that these are really so dangerous, why do you believe that we haven't seen more deaths or serious injury? Is it because, and on the flip side, maybe that there are officers out there who are being smart and safe about using this weapon?
Well, you know, tasers have been linked to hundreds of deaths, so it's now, of course, they've been used many more times than that. And I think you're right to identify that there are lots of officers out there, I'm sure, who are using tasers in entirely appropriate manners. And there are probably many, many incidents in which using tasers has been the right thing because it's been an alternative to guns or more lethal force, and it's effectively worked to make a situation safer. And that's what the manufacturer and law enforcement agencies have sold tasers as to the New York public. And if that's what they are, then that's a great thing. But what's interesting is that the data that we looked at shows that sometimes they are that, but most of the time it's not that way. And most of the time tasers are being used in ways that are not justified and are just exposing New Yorkers who encounter police officers to greater dangers. And what we really need is to make sure that we have training and policies in place to ensure that tasers are being used in the good ways and they're not being used in the abusive ways.
Okay, well, unfortunately we are out of time, but if you wouldn't just mind, I think this is online, right? So if people are interested in taking a look at it, they would be able to access it there?
Yeah, the report's available at www.nyclu.org. It's as of today, it's the first item right up there on that web screen, and you can download it for free online.
Corey, I want to thank you very much for your time. It's actually a really interesting report. I hope people take a look at it.
Great, thanks a lot.